Look at this paper, Dad. It's not a retirement plan. It's an eviction notice. My son-in-law Brad didn't just hand it to me. He threw the heavy folder onto my oak desk as if he were discarding a piece of trash. The sound of paper hitting wood was dry, but the humiliation tasted like ash in my throat. I looked at Sarah, my only daughter. This was the child I had carried through midnight fevers, and the same girl for whom I had built a forensic auditing empire just to provide her a dowry. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was too busy checking her reflection in the mirror, adjusting the $200,000 diamond necklace I had gifted her only last month. "Just sign it, Dad." Sarah said, her voice as cold as cracking ice. "Brad is right. You're starting to forget things. Keeping you in charge of the company now would be an insult to the shareholders. And honestly, having you in this house, it's making us feel suffocated." Brad let out a sharp laugh as he grabbed a black garbage bag and began sweeping my awards, my veterans medals, and the photographs of my late wife into it. "From now on, this room is my startup office. U St. Mary's nursing home has a small room overlooking the dumpster. It fits your current style perfectly." My blood felt like it was freezing. I knew they were greedy, but I never imagined they could be this cruel, tearing my dignity apart in the very place where I was once king. The shame was overwhelming, not because I was losing everything, but because I realized I had raised two monsters. Before I reveal how I turned this eviction notice into a death warrant for their careers, please leave a comment if you agree that shared blood should never be mistaken for shared values. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the moment I make them beg for a forgiveness they will never receive. The dinner party that evening at our Greenwich estate was not a celebration. It was a public execution. Brad had invited my most powerful partner's men who once feared and respected me to witness the fall of the old lion. This $1 million villa was the symbol of my success in forensic auditing. Every brick was paid for with my sweat and sleepless nights. But tonight, the glowing chandeliers only seemed to highlight my perceived pathetic state. I sat at the head of the table, but no one offered a toast. I was a ghost at my own funeral. Brad stood up and tapped a glass of 1982 Mouton Rothschild, my finest wine, which he had helped himself to from my cellar to impress his hollow startup friends. "Listen up, everyone," Brad announced, his hand resting possessively on Sarah's shoulder. "As you know, our father Bill has had a wonderful run, but time is an enemy to us all. To protect the family legacy, I will officially take over as CEO tonight. Bill will be moving to a specialized medical facility to manage his cognitive decline." The room erupted in applause. People who once begged for my help now looked at me with pity or contempt for an old man they thought was senile. I looked down at my plate. Brad had instructed the chef not to serve me steak. Instead, I was given a bowl of thin, tasteless soup meant for a toddler. "It's easier for you to swallow, Dad," he said with a wink to Sarah. My daughter, my pride and joy, actually giggled. The humiliation reached its peak. My hands shook not from age, but from a fury so intense it was suffocating. I looked at the Patek Philippe on my wrist. The second hand was still moving. It reminded me that the truth always finds a way, and justice often arrives just when the wicked feel most secure. Sarah leaned in close, her expensive perfume making me nauseous. "Don't make a scene, Dad," she whispered. "Once you sign the papers tomorrow, I'll have someone bring Mom's old things to the home for you. If you're good, I might visit once a month." I said nothing. I just watched. I watched Brad hold his wine glass incorrectly and boast about crypto investments he was funding with company capital. He thought I didn't know. He thought my brain had rotted like my old bones. But Brad forgot one thing. I am a forensic auditor. I don't look at what people say. I look at what they hide. While they were planning this party, I was using the remote access service .x on the central servers. I discovered Brad had embezzled $4 million to cover his personal losses. He had forged my signature on dozens of documents, and Sarah, my own daughter, had helped him by using the access codes I had trusted her with. They thought St. Mary's would silence me, but they didn't know that the facility is owned by an old friend from my days in special investigations. As the party ended, Brad escorted me to the door, handing me a small trash bag containing my old house slippers. "A parting gift, old man," he laughed. I took the bag and looked him directly in the eyes for the first time all night. My calmness seemed to make his smile falter. "Brad, do you know the difference between a hunter and the prey?" He smirked and asked if I was getting senile again. "The prey always thinks it's getting away," I replied with a smile he would see in his nightmares. "The hunter is just waiting for the right moment to close the trap." I stepped into the waiting taxi. As we pulled away, I looked in the mirror. Sarah and Brad stood there hand in hand, looking powerful in the golden lights of the mansion. They had no idea that inside the bag Brad had just handed me was the hard drive containing the evidence that would end them both. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, the real game begins. "The smell of ammonia is the first thing that tells a man he has been discarded," Martha, I said, as she placed the tray on the bedside table without a sound. "It is the clinical scent of a system that views a human life as a stain to be scrubbed away, a lingering chemical mask for the fact that St. Mary's is where legacies come to die." I looked at the walls, which were a shade of beige so aggressive in its neutrality that it felt like a personal insult to a man who had spent 40 years looking at the vibrant skyline of Manhattan from an office made of glass and steel. "Brad thinks he is a genius for putting me here." I continued, my voice raspy from the cold air of the taxi ride. "He believes that by placing me in a $1,200 a month room overlooking a dumpster, he has successfully transitioned me from a patriarch to a line item on a balance sheet." Martha stood by the door, her presence the only thing in this room that didn't feel like a calculated humiliation. "You need to eat something." "Bill," she whispered. But we both knew the food was just a prop for the hallway cameras. I reached into the black plastic bag Brad had handed me at the gate, the one he called a parting gift. I pulled out my old house slippers, the felt worn thin from years of pacing the library, while I solved the financial riddles of men much more dangerous than him. "It is a toxic little detail, Martha, that he chose these to give back to me," I said, holding them up. "He wanted to remind me that I no longer have a floor of my own to walk on." But he was so blinded by his own arrogance that he didn't feel the weight of the left heel. I felt the rigid square hidden deep within the fabric, a situational anomaly that Brad's greedy fingers had missed because he was too busy filming his own victory for his social media followers. "Sarah put this there," I told Martha as I extracted the micro SD card. When she hugged me and told the world I was suffocating her, she wasn't just performing for the cameras. She was sliding the key to the safe into my hand. Everyone in that garden believed she had turned into a monster, Martha. They made the emotional assumption that she had traded her father for a diamond necklace and a seat at the table of a failing startup. Even I felt the sting of it, the shame of thinking I had raised a daughter who could watch her husband toss her father's veteran medals into the trash. But this card contains the remote access service.exe files I need, I said, my fingers trembling as I slotted the card into the laptop Martha had smuggled in. "Brad is playing a game he doesn't understand," I explained, while the screen flickered to life with the green glow of encrypted ledgers. "He took out a $4.2 million bridge loan against the Greenwich estate at a 12% interest rate, Martha. He thinks he's a shark, but he's just a feeder fish. He used the property as collateral for a high-risk crypto arbitrage scheme that is currently bleeding $60,000 a day. He believes there is no way back for me because the transfer deed I signed is notarized and filed. He thinks he's insulated by the very system I helped build." The irony is thick enough to choke on Martha. I continued staring at the data points that proved my son-in-law had embezzled $4 million from the company's pension fund. to cover his initial losses. He sees this nursing home as my final destination, but he has no idea it is actually my forward operating base. He believes the house is his, but a bridge loan is a suicide pact if the underlying asset is flagged for a fraudulent conveyance. I spent my career as a forensic auditor finding the one thread that, when pulled, brings the entire tapestry down. Brad didn't just pull the thread. He handed it to me in a trash bag. I looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking away, the final hours of Brad's unearned empire. Sarah had to play the villain, Martha. I said, the realization of her sacrifice hitting me harder than the humiliation of the eviction. She had to make him feel so untouchable that he would move the physical files to the basement safe tonight. If she hadn't pushed me out, he would have remained cautious. Now he is celebratory. And a celebratory man is a sloppy man. He thinks I am sitting here in the dark, crying over a bowl of thin soup. He doesn't realize that I am currently remapping his entire digital footprint through the very servers he thinks he owns. The false bottom of this tragedy is that everyone thinks the story ended at the garden gate, I told Martha as I began the first stage of the counter audit. They think the old man lost, the youth won, and the house is gone. But in 36 hours, the bank will receive a tip about the unpermitted structural modifications Brad made to the east wing. Those modifications void the property insurance. And without insurance, the bridge loan defaults automatically. Brad will be left holding a $4 million debt to people who don't care about his startup pitch. He wanted to give me a room with a view of the dumpster, Martha. I said, a cold smile finally reaching my eyes. I think it's only fair that I give him a view of a prison yard. This micro SD card is not just data. It is a kill switch for a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. I am not just a grandfather who was betrayed, Martha. I am a hunter who has finally seen the prey wander into the center of the trap. He thinks he's a king, but he's just a squatter in a house that's about to fall down around him. The silence of St. Mary's is a heavy thing, Martha. But it is the kind of silence a man can use to hear the gears of a trap finally beginning to turn. You saw Sarah's face at the garden party when she told the crowd I was losing my mind, didn't you? You saw her adjust that diamond necklace and look at me with what everyone assumed was cold, calculated disgust. But that was the performance of a lifetime, a necessary mask to hide the fact that she is the only person currently standing between my legacy and total annihilation. I need you to listen closely, because what I found on the micro SD card she hid in the heel of my slipper changes the entire nature of this investigation. Brad thinks he's a genius for orchestrating this voluntary transfer of assets. But he's actually just a pawn who has been allowed to walk into a kill zone. Sarah couldn't act openly, Martha. She explained it all in the encrypted voice memos she left for me. If she had defended me even once, Brad would have invoked spousal privilege to keep her from testifying. Or worse, he would have moved the physical ledgers to a location we couldn't track. By pretending to be his accomplice, by being the one to hand me the eviction notice, she became the only person he trusts to manage his digital keys. I've spent the last 4 hours inside the remote access service.exe, and the data is far more terrifying than a simple case of elder financial abuse. Brad isn't just trying to steal my house and my company to fund a startup. He's running a multi-state Ponzi scheme that has already swallowed $4 million of the company's pension fund. He's been using unhosted crypto wallets to move the capital through a series of shell companies in the Caymans, thinking that a forensic auditor of my age wouldn't know how to track a blockchain transaction. Dad, you have to play the part of the dying patriarch for just 48 more hours, Sarah's voice said in the recording, and I could hear the tremor she was hiding from Brad. She told me that the deed I signed, the one Brad was so proud of, wasn't the final version his lawyers drafted. She swapped the pages at the last second, long gip, a fraudulent conveyance trigger, into the fine print. The moment Brad tries to use that property as collateral for his high-interest bridge loan tomorrow morning, It will trigger an automatic audit by the Bureau of Financial Crimes. Brad thinks he's the hunter, Martha, but he's just a man standing in a room full of gunpowder with a lit match bragging about the light. He told me at the party that my medals were trash. But Sarah was the one who made sure those specific boxes were packed and sent here. Inside the lining of my old veteran's jacket is the physical hard drive Brad thinks he destroyed last month. It contains the original unaltered ledgers from before he began the embezzlement. We aren't just looking at a greedy son-in-law anymore, Martha. We are looking at a man who is being investigated by the federal government for wire fraud and conspiracy. Sarah stayed in that house tonight because she needs to be there when he accesses the basement safe. He's going to move the remaining $400,000 in cash tonight to prepare for his exit strategy. And Sarah is going to ensure that the GPS trackers I've embedded in the currency straps are activated. The world sees an old man who was brought to his knees by his own flesh and blood, but they are only seeing the false bottom of this tragedy. They don't see the structural friction we've created to keep Brad trapped in his own greed. Sarah had to humiliate me, Martha. She had to make it look irreversible so that Brad would stop looking over his shoulder. She told me in the recording that she hated every second of it, the way she spoke to me, the way she let him kick my boxes. But she knew it was the only way to get him to sign the admission of debt papers disguised as his new CEO contract. Brad is currently celebrating his victory with my finest champagne, unaware that every sip is being funded by a loan that has already defaulted in the bank's internal system. He thinks he's insulated by the legal system, but he doesn't realize that the legal system is exactly what I'm using to crush him. I'm not going to use violence, and I'm not going to use a public scandal that would ruin Sarah's reputation. I'm going to use the very institutional mechanisms he tried to manipulate. Sarah's hidden action wasn't just about saving the money, Martha. It was about saving the honor of this family. She told me that when she saw him throw my medals away, she almost broke character, but she remembered what I always taught her: never mistake shared blood for shared values. She is my true heir, not because of her name, but because she has the stomach to do what is necessary to ensure justice is served. Brad is a vulture waiting for me to die, but he has no idea that the carcass he's hovering over is actually a trap designed by a man who has spent 40 years catching vultures just like him. He thinks I'm sitting here in this nursing home broken and forgotten, but I am currently the most dangerous person in his life. I have the remote access service .exe running a continuous trace on his crypto wallets, and the moment he attempts to move that stolen pension money tonight, the kill switch I've embedded in the server will freeze every account associated with his name. The audience to this drama will eventually see the reversal, but they will never truly understand the depth of the betrayal Sarah had to perform to make it happen. She is risking everything, her marriage, her social standing, and her safety, to ensure that her father isn't remembered as a senile old man who was robbed by his children. She is the secret ally that no one expected, and together we are going to ensure that Brad's Ki Nguyen Moi ends in a prison cell. Martha, tell the regional office of the Bureau of Financial Crimes that the auditor is ready. Tell them that the dying patriarch has finished his investigation and that the evidence of the $4 million Ponzi scheme is ready for collection. Brad thinks he's a king, but tomorrow morning he's going to find out what happens when you try to steal from a man who knows where every single cent is buried. The hunter is no longer waiting, Martha. The hunter is closing the trap. I've spent 40 years learning that true power isn't about who holds the physical deed to a property. It is about who understands the intricate rules of the institutional system better than anyone else. As I pace the narrow confines of my room at St. Mary's, a habit from a lifetime of professional audits where a single contact could break a multi-million-dollar case, I realized I was no longer just an old man in a nursing home. I was a forensic auditor, reactivating a network that Brad, in his youthful arrogance, didn't even know existed. I reached for the secure phone Martha had provided, the one that bypassed the facility's main switchboard, and dialed a number I had kept in my memory since the day I helped a man named Arthur clear his name of a false zoning violation a decade ago. Arthur, it's Bill. I'm calling because I need a forensic favor that only someone from the municipal building department could handle, I said when he answered my voice, steady and cold for the first time since the garden party. I explained the technical reality of the situation at the Greenwich estate. I told him that the man currently occupying my home, my son-in-law Brad, had made unpermitted structural modifications to the east wing last month to create a high-tech startup incubator. I detailed how Brad had removed 2 critical load-bearing support beams to achieve an open-concept floor plan, all without filing a single permit or consulting a structural engineer. Bill, you know as well as I do that if those beams are gone, the entire property is a legal and physical liability, Arthur replied, his voice sounding like gravel over the line. I agreed, explaining that the $4.2 million bridge loan Brad had secured against the property was contingent on the house being fully insured. I told him that if he could verify those specific permit violations and notify the county inspectors, the insurance company would be forced to void his policy immediately. In the world of institutional finance, a property without insurance is a loan in immediate default. And I knew the bank wouldn't wait for a civil trial to protect its investment. Arthur cautioned me that he couldn't just barge into the house as a private citizen. He wasn't a savior, just a retired bureaucrat. I told him I didn't need a hero. I just needed him to provide the specific building codes that had been violated to the bank's risk management department. The information is the only weapon I need, Arthur, I said. Once the bank sees the lack of permits for a modification that compromises the foundation, they will trigger an unannounced inspection within 48 hours to protect their interests. As I hung up, Martha looked at me with a mix of respect and concern. But Bill, how do you pay for the legal filings if the bank moves too slowly to stop him from fleeing? She asked. I had to admit the limitation that kept this tension grounded in reality. Brad had drained my liquid assets and frozen my personal accounts during the fraudulent transfer. I didn't have the cash for a high-priced attorney to fight a standard civil case, and I couldn't rely on a savior to buy my way back into my own life. That's exactly why I'm not suing him, Martha, I explained. I'm using the state's own regulatory systems to do the work for me. The bank and the IRS have more lawyers than Brad could ever dream of, and once they realize he lied on his loan application about the condition of the property, they will become my unwitting infantry. I turned back to the laptop accessing the remote access service.exe to monitor the real-time activity on the company's main server. I could see Brad was still attempting to move the pension funds into those unhosted crypto wallets, but the competence rebuild was already working beneath the surface. I wasn't relying on a lucky coincidence. I was relying on the fact that Brad's arrogance made him ignore the very rules that now formed his noose. He thinks he destroyed my social role as the provider and the owner, Martha, I said, recalling the humiliation of being told I was a cost to be cut. But he forgot that before I was a father or an owner, I was a man who spent 40 years finding the one technicality that could bring down an empire. The tension remained high because Sarah was still in that house playing the role of the accomplice. If Brad discovered the micro SD card was missing or realized Arthur was snooping around the building department records, the entire systemic reversal would collapse before it began. Sarah is my only set of eyes inside the perimeter, Martha, I whispered. She has to stay there until the bank sends the inspector. If she leaves now, he might get suspicious and move the cash he has hidden in the basement safe. I understood the moral ambiguity of letting my daughter stay with a man who was embezzling millions, but it was the only way to ensure the reversal was absolute. I spent the next few hours meticulously logging every fraudulent transaction Brad made through his shell companies, using my old auditing skills to map his digital footprint. I wasn't just an old man waiting for the end. I was a hunter who had finally regained his tools. "Look at this account here, Martha," I said, pointing to the screen where the remote access service.x was tracking a transfer to a BM Holdings in the Caymans. He thinks that because it's an offshore account, the IRS won't find it. But he forgot that I spent 5 years as a consultant for the Bureau of Financial Crimes. I showed her how I was cross-referencing these timestamps with the unpermitted structural modifications Arthur was investigating. He used the embezzled pension funds to pay the contractors for that lab, I noted. If those contractors didn't have a permit, they likely weren't bonded, meaning Brad has no legal recourse when the foundation starts to crack, which it will because those support beams were the only thing holding up the library on the second floor. I could feel the old thrill of the investigation, the competence rebuild making me feel 40 years younger as the pieces of the trap fell into place. I was no longer the humiliated figure from the garden party. I was the forensic architect of Brad's coming ruin. "Martha, tell Sarah she needs to be ready to leave the second the inspector knocks on the door tomorrow morning," I said. "The limitation of our position is that we can only trigger the system. We can't control the speed at which it moves once the gears start turning. But I knew that once the machine started, it wouldn't stop until Brad was stripped of everything he had stolen. The role inversion was almost complete. The man who was once the master of the house was now the master of the trap, and the man who thought he had won was about to become the state's most prominent debtor. I told her I wasn't doing this for revenge, even though the ash in my throat had finally turned into the sweet taste of impending justice. I was doing this to protect the family legacy, proving that age doesn't mean obsolescence. It means experience. And experience, as Brad was about to learn, is the one thing you can't embezzle from a pension fund. Friday morning did not arrive with a scream or a struggle. It arrived with the quiet rhythmic clicking of a briefcase being opened in the foyer of my Greenwich estate. Brad was standing in the kitchen, still wearing his silk robe, holding a cup of espresso he had bought with a company credit card that was already flagged for suspicious activity. He thought he was the master of the house, but the system I had spent 40 years mastering was about to prove otherwise. When the knock came at the door, he didn't even look up from his tablet, where he was watching the fluctuating value of his illicit crypto wallets. "Brad, there are men here from the regional bank and the Bureau of Financial Crimes." Sarah said, her voice devoid of the tremor she had been faking for the last 72 hours. She stood by the front door, already dressed in a sharp suit, holding a physical folder that Brad had never seen before. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" "Tell them I'm in a meeting. We just finalized the $4.2 million bridge loan yesterday. The capital should be hitting the startup account by noon," Brad replied, his arrogance still shielding him from the reality of the noose. He walked toward the door, expecting to brush off a minor administrative delay with a smile and a handshake. One of the men in the foyer, a lead investigator I had known for 15 years, didn't offer a hand. "Mr. Miller, we are here because your 12% interest bridge loan has been placed in immediate default." He said, his tone as clinical as a surgical strike. The bank's risk management department received a tip regarding unpermitted structural modifications to the east wing. As of 6 o'clock this morning, your property insurance has been voided, which triggered an automatic acceleration clause on the entire debt. Brad's face went the color of dry parchment. "That's impossible. I have a signed transfer deed from Bill. The house is mine. Any modifications I make are my business," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Sarah for support. "The house isn't yours, Brad. It never was," Sarah said, stepping forward to hand the investigator the folder. "The deed my father signed contained a specific fraudulent conveyance clause. The moment you used that deed to secure a loan, while knowingly embezzling $4 million from the company's pension fund, the transfer became legally null and void." You're delusional," Brad hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have the digital keys. I have the crypto wallets. You can't prove a thing without my passwords." "We don't need your passwords, Brad. I said, my voice coming through the speaker of Sarah's phone, which she held up like a mirror to his soul. I've been monitoring every single transaction through the remote access service.exe since the moment I arrived at St. Mary's. I have the digital trail of all $4 million as they moved from the pension fund into your shell companies in the Caymans. The lead investigator nodded to his colleagues. Mr. Miller, the IRS has already frozen every account associated with your name, including the BM Holdings accounts you thought were offshore, because you lied on your loan application about the condition of the property and the source of your collateral. This is now a federal matter. Brad tried to reach for his tablet, perhaps to attempt a final desperate transfer, but Sarah blocked his path. It's over, Brad. The system you thought you could manipulate is the same one that just locked your digital cage. You wanted to cut my father out as a cost, but you forgot that a forensic auditor knows how to make the costs of a crime astronomical. You did this, Brad muttered, looking at Sarah with a mixture of shock and hatred. You were the one who told me to move the files to the basement safe. You were the one who pushed the bridge loan. I was the one who ensured you had enough rope to hang yourself, Brad, Sarah replied, her voice firm and righteous. Publicly, the world is going to see a startup founder arrested for massive wire fraud. Privately, I've already filed for divorce under the bad faith statutes of our prenuptial agreement. You're not just going to prison, you're going to prison bankrupt. The control had shifted so quietly that the neighbors outside sipping their morning coffee had no idea the king of the estate was being led away in handcuffs. There was no violence, no shouting, just the cold, efficient application of institutional power. Brad couldn't fight back openly because to do so would require him to provide a legitimate source for the millions he had moved, a source that didn't exist. Bill, we have the physical hard drive from the safe, the investigator said into the phone. Sarah swapped the original for a decoy weeks ago. We have everything we need for the conspiracy and attempted murder charges regarding the medication tampering. I sat in my small room at St. Mary's, watching the live feed from the estate's security cameras through the remote access service.exe. I saw Brad being placed into the back of a black sedan. I saw Sarah stand on the porch of the house I had built, looking out over the garden where I had been humiliated just days ago. The systemic reversal was absolute. Control hadn't just returned to me. It had been fortified by the very law Brad thought he was above. Sarah, come and get me, I said quietly into the phone. It's time to clean up the trash Brad left behind. I had played the part of the dying patriarch, perfectly allowing the enemy to feel so confident in their victory that they became blind to their own structural failures. The humiliation of the garden party was a small price to pay for the complete and legalized destruction of a man who mistook shared blood for shared values. The house was no longer a liability. It was a crime scene, and soon it would be a home again. The car door closed with a finality that the nursing home never could provide. I stood at the edge of the driveway, looking up at the house I had built stone by stone, audit by audit. Sarah was there, standing on the top step, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon sun. She held something in her hand, a small bright glint of metal that felt like the center of the universe. "Dad, you're back," she said as I walked up the stone path. Her voice didn't have the ice in it anymore. The cold clinical mask she wore at the garden party had slipped, but what was underneath wasn't entirely warm either. She reached out and pressed the heavy brass key into my palm, the symbolic object of my lost status, now returned. The investigators are finished. The locks haven't been changed yet, though Brad intended to do that Monday morning. I looked down at the key. It felt heavier than it used to, a physical weight that carried the history of the last 72 hours. You know, Sarah, when you told those people I was a cost to be cut, it didn't feel like a performance. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, echoing the somber tone of a man who had seen too much. I've spent 40 years finding the truth in numbers, but I couldn't find the lie in your eyes that night. She didn't look away. Her gaze was as firm as the forensic evidence we had gathered. It had to be that way, Dad. If I had flinched, he would have known. He spent every night checking the basement safe, looking for a reason to doubt me. If I hadn't pushed you out, he never would have moved the physical files. He never would have signed the admission of debt that we buried in that CEO contract. I know, I replied the auditor, in me acknowledging the tactical necessity. I saw it all through the remote access service.exe. I watched him celebrate while you were setting the final trigger. But tell me something. When you said my presence in this house made you feel suffocated, was that part of the script, or was that the truth of the last 5 years? The silence between us stretched out longer and more uncomfortable than the 3 days I spent in that sterile room at St. Mary's. The bridge loan is gone, Dad, she said, dodging the question with a precision that reminded me of myself. The Bureau of Financial Crimes confirmed the $4 million embezzlement. Brad is looking at 20 years for wire fraud and conspiracy. The IRS has already started the seizure of his personal assets to repay the pension fund. You're the hero of the story again. I don't feel like a hero, I said, turning the brass key over in my fingers, watching the light catch its polished surface. I feel like a man who used his own daughter as a Trojan horse. This key, it used to mean I belonged here. Now it just feels like a piece of administrative evidence. It represents a victory, but it doesn't represent a home. The estate is back in your name, Bill, she said, using my name instead of Dad for a moment, a slip that revealed the distance between us. The fraudulent conveyance was filed an hour ago. You have your master of the house roll back. Isn't that what we worked for? I looked at the house. The windows were dark, reflecting the empty rooms where my life used to be. The east wing, with its unpermitted modifications and missing load-bearing beams, stood like a wounded limb. A house is just a structure, Sarah. I'm a forensic auditor. I know that better than anyone. You can fix a foundation and you can refile a deed, but you can't audit a feeling of betrayal out of a relationship. He's going to prison, Dad. Bankrupt and alone. She insisted, her voice rising as if trying to convince herself. The system worked. We used the institutional reversal just like you planned. The public sees him as a fraud, and the private consequence is that he's lost everything. And what did we lose? I asked. I thought about the boxes of my late wife's things that Brad threw in the trash while you watched. I thought about the way the neighbors looked at me when I was escorted to the taxi like a nuisance. The emotional aftertaste of this win. It's bitter, Sarah. It tastes like the ash I felt in my throat when you laughed at Brad's jokes about my memory. I saved you, Dad, she whispered, her eyes finally welling up, breaking the cold distance she had maintained. I know you did, I said, and I reached out to touch her shoulder, but I hesitated. The performance had been too good. The toxic small detail of her giggling while I was fed thin soup, it was burned into my mind. But the problem with playing the villain so well is that part of the audience never forgets the role. I'm back in my house, and the bad man is gone. But I'm standing here with a key to a building where my daughter once told me I was a burden. We have the hard drive, Bill, she said, trying to pull us back to the safety of the facts and the technical success of the mission. The investigators said the GPS trackers in the cache worked perfectly. We recovered $380,000 from his car. The case is closed. The legal case is closed. I agreed, looking at the key one last time before slipping it into my pocket. But the loop of our family, that's still open. I've spent my life closing loops, Sarah. I thought if I won this, everything would go back to how it was before Brad arrived. but the structural friction we used to trap him, it rubbed off on us too. I turned and walked back toward the taxi that had waited for me at the end of the driveway. "I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight," I said without looking back. "Why, the house is yours again," she called out, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls. "Because right now this house is just a crime scene," I said, "and I need to figure out if I'm the victim or the architect of my own isolation. Brad is in a cell, but looking at you right now, I'm not sure which one of us is truly free." I stepped back into the taxi. As we drove away, I felt the brass key in my pocket. It was a beautiful object, heavy and polished. But its meaning had changed forever. It wasn't a symbol of legacy anymore. It was a symbol of what happens when you decide that the only way to save your family is to destroy it first. The win was absolute. The reversal was legalized, but as I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, the only thing I felt was the silence of a man who had finally regained his power and realized he had nowhere left to use it. The silence of St. Mary's is not the peace of a resting man, Martha. It is the calculated stillness of a hunter who has finally found the center of a $4 million trap. I spent 42 years as a forensic auditor, learning that every empire has a structural weakness, and I've spent the last few hours using the remote access service.exe to find Brad's. He believes he has successfully transitioned me from a patriarch to a discarded expense. But he forgot that a man with my training doesn't need a house to be dangerous, he only needs the right information. I told you when I first arrived that this beige room was a sanctuary for my concentration. And now the digital pings on my screen are confirming that the architecture of Brad's collapse is already shifting from a possibility to an inevitability. You asked me why I am so confident that a man with a $4.2 million bridge loan and the deed to my estate can be brought down by an old man in a $1,200 a month room. I'll tell you exactly why Brad's arrogance is his primary liability. He secured that loan at a 12% interest rate, pledging this house as his primary collateral. But he neglected to read the material breach clauses that I've spent my life drafting for the world's largest banks. I've already contacted Arthur at the Municipal Building Department, and he has confirmed that the structural modifications Brad made to the east wing, those load-bearing beams he removed to build his open-concept startup lab, have rendered the entire property a catastrophic insurance risk. In the world of institutional finance, Martha, a property without insurance is a loan in immediate default, and I know for a fact that the bank's risk management team is already preparing to accelerate the debt. But the bridge loan is just the surface of the rot. Through the remote access service.exe, I have mapped a zinc chelator of shell companies that Brad has been using to move the $4 million he embezzled from the company's pension fund. He thinks that by layering the stolen capital through unhosted crypto wallets and offshore accounts in the Caymans, he has created a digital ghost that no auditor can find. He is wrong. I've spent 5 years as a consultant for the Bureau of Financial Crimes, and I know that every digital transaction leaves a footprint if you know where to look. I have the time-stamped logs of every cent he moved, and I've cross-referenced them with the remote access logs Sarah provided. I need you to listen to the audio feed from the basement safe, Martha, because this is where the role inversion becomes a public execution. Sarah is down there with him right now, and her performance is the only thing keeping Brad from realizing that the kill switch I embedded in the server is already closing the loop on his freedom. Brad, why are we moving these physical files at 3 in the morning if the audit isn't supposed to happen for another month? Sarah's voice is a masterpiece of feigned confusion. She is playing the devoted accomplice, while her father audits his daughter's husband into a 20-year sentence. Brad's response is the sound of a man who realized his Kingwin Moi is actually a sinking ship. The audit is happening tomorrow at 8 in the morning, Sarah. The bank sent a notice of default because of some unpermitted alterations I made to the East Wing. If I don't get these original pension ledgers out of the safe and into the shredder before the forensic team arrives, we're finished. I watched through the remote access service.exe as he opened the secondary compartment of the safe the one where he keeps the toxic small details of his embezzlement. He has no idea that Sarah has already swapped those ledgers for forensic duplicates that contain a hidden watermark identifying them as state evidence. I've got the hard drive, Sarah. The one Bill thinks is his secret weapon. Brad's voice has that jagged, desperate arrogance of a man who thinks he's just dodged a bullet. Once I destroy this, the old man can scream about audits until he's blue in the face. But there won't be a single byte of data left to prove I ever touched that pension money. We'll leave him here to rot with his memories, and we'll be on a plane to the beach by Friday. He doesn't realize that the drive he's currently crushing under his heel is a decoy I planted weeks ago. The real drive, the one containing the remote access service.exe logs and the crypto wallet keys, is already in the hands of the regional director of the Bureau of Financial Crimes. Martha, this is the false bottom that the audience to this tragedy never saw coming. Everyone in that garden believed that Sarah had traded her father for a diamond necklace and a seat at the head of a startup. They made the emotional assumption that she was a traitor, but they didn't see the hidden intention behind every cruel word she spoke to me. She had to humiliate me. She had to make Brad feel so untouchable that he would move the evidence to the very place where we could track it. She told me in the recording that she hated every second of it, especially the way she laughed when he threw my veteran medals into the trash. But she knew that a forensic audit of a family requires the most painful kind of sacrifice. He's heading upstairs to pack the cash bags, Bill, you noted, and I can tell you that every bag he touches is already a data point on a federal map. I have embedded GPS trackers in the currency straps of the $380,000 he has hidden in that vault. He thinks he is preparing for an exit strategy, but he is actually just preparing his own luggage for a prison cell. I've broken his crime down into 3 distinct violations of the law: wire fraud, the embezzlement of $4 million in pension assets, and a material breach of contract that has already cost him the house he tried to steal. The architecture of his collapse is complete, Martha. He wanted to treat me like a cost to be cut, but I've just finalized the accounting. He told me I was suffocating the family, but he is the one who is about to find out how thin the air is when the FBI is standing in your foyer. Never mistake shared blood for shared values, because while Brad was focused on the money, Sarah and I were focused on the justice. I told her that the final audit of a life is not about what you take, but about what you protect. And by sunrise, the man who tried to turn my legacy into a dumpster fire will be looking for a lawyer he can no longer afford. The countdown has reached 30 minutes, Martha. The dying patriarch is finished with his investigation, and the hunter is closing the trap. Tell the investigators that we have the physical confession on tape, and the digital trail of the $4 million is secure. Brad thinks he is a king, but the system is about to remind him that in the world of forensic auditing, the truth always finds a way. Martha, the digital clock on this beige wall isn't just marking the hours. It is a metronome for a 40-year career that is about to reach its final thunderous crescendo. I sat in the darkness of this nursing home room, the blue light from the laptop screen illuminating the lines of code on the remote access service.exe like a map to a hidden grave. I told you when I first arrived that this room was a sanctuary for my concentration, a place where I could play the dying patriarch to perfection while I reactivated every professional network I've built since before Brad was born. Look at the pings on this secondary monitor, Martha. Those are the desperate heartbeats of a man who realized too late that you cannot outrun a forensic auditor with a few lines of stolen code and a bridge loan built on a foundation of sand. The tension in this room is a physical weight, but it is nothing compared to the structural friction I've created inside that house. I need you to understand the mechanics of what is happening right now. Because in the world of institutional power, the one who understands the system better than his opponent is the only one who truly owns the board. Brad is currently in the basement safe at the estate, his fingers flying across a keypad that I've already remapped to alert the Bureau of Financial Crimes the moment he enters his secondary encryption key. He told me at the garden party that I was a cost to be cut, a senile old man who was suffocating the family legacy. But he's about to find out that the most expensive cost in a betrayal is the one you never saw coming on the balance sheet. Bill, the regional bank, just initiated the formal notice of default. You whispered to me while you checked the hallway monitor to ensure the night shift stayed clear of our operations center. I nodded my eyes, never leaving the data streaming through the remote access service.exe. I told you that the unpermitted structural modifications Brad made to the east wing were the primary kill switch. By removing those load-bearing support beams to create his startup lab, he didn't just violate a zoning ordinance. He triggered a material breach of his $4.2 million bridge loan agreement. In the world of high-stakes finance, Martha, a property without insurance is a loan in immediate acceleration, and I've spent the last 6 hours ensuring the bank's risk management team has everything they need to seize the assets. I want you to listen to this audio feed from the basement vault because the role inversion is almost complete. Sarah, why is the server rejecting the Cayman's transfer? I followed the encryption protocol exactly. Brad's voice is a jagged, frantic sound, stripped of the arrogance he wore like a designer's suit just 3 days ago. Sarah's response is a masterpiece of narrative distance, her voice calm and clinical as she leads him further into the center of the trap. Maybe it's just a glitch, Brad. Did you try the secondary password Bill used for the audit files? She asks, knowing that the moment he types that password, he is signing his own federal indictment. He is panicking, Martha, and a panicked man makes the kind of incremental reveals that a forensic auditor can use to bury him. He thinks that by moving the company's pension funds through a zinc chelator of shell companies, he has created a digital ghost that no state investigator can find. But he was so focused on the exit strategy that he forgot the 333 rule I taught Sarah since she was 10 years old. Every transaction must have a documented time, a verifiable place, and a character with a legal right to act. Brad has none of these, and the remote access service.exe is currently mapping his digital footprint across 3 continents in real time. The audience to this tragedy made the emotional assumption that Sarah had traded her father for a diamond necklace and a seat at the head of a startup. They saw her laugh when he threw my veteran medals into a black trash bag, and they felt the moral outrage of a daughter siding with a predator. But they didn't see the hidden intention behind every cruel word. She had to humiliate me. She had to make Brad feel so untouchable that he would move the physical ledgers and the embezzled cash to the very safe where we could track them. She is risking everything, her marriage, her social standing, and her safety to ensure that the dying patriarch has the evidence he needs to finalize the audit of his life. He's grabbing the cash bags now, Bill, you noted, pointing to the motion sensors in the garage. I told you that a man like Brad, when the digital walls close in, will always revert to the tangible. He thinks the $380,000 he has hidden in that vault is his escape fund, but he doesn't know that Sarah has already activated the GPS trackers I embedded in the currency straps. Every step he takes toward the garage is a data point on a federal map. And every breath he takes is being logged as part of a conspiracy to commit wire fraud and embezzlement. I sat back, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, feeling the cold satisfaction of a hunter who has finally seen the prey wander into the center of the kill zone. This isn't just about the money, Martha. It's about the poetic justice of a man being destroyed by the very systems he thought he could manipulate. He wanted to give me a room with a view of a dumpster at St. Mary's, but I've given him a future with a view of a prison yard. I've spent my life applying logic and technical accuracy to catch vultures, and today the vulture is finally coming home to roost. The turning point happened at 4:15 a.m. when the IRS Criminal Investigation Division confirmed the freeze on his unhosted crypto wallets. I watched as his screen displayed the access denied message, a symbolic closure to his unearned empire. I keyed the microphone one last time, my voice dropping into that somber, reflective tone that used to make crooked CEOs tremble in their boardrooms. Brad, it's the cost calling to collect. I said the words echoing through the intercom system he thought he had disconnected. I've spent the last 48 hours auditing your Ki Nguyen Moi, and I'm afraid the balance sheet is fundamentally broken. The bridge loan has defaulted, the bank is seizing the house, and the Bureau of Financial Crimes is currently 3 minutes from your driveway. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying payoff of my career. I watched on the monitor as he dropped the bags of cash, his face a mask of raw, jagged panic in the golden lights of the foyer. Sarah stood behind him, no longer the accomplice, but the witness to his total humiliation. The hunter isn't dying, Martha. He's just finished the final audit, and for the first time in a long time, the truth has finally found its way home. The agents are at the gate, Bill, you said, and I closed the laptop. The trap is closed, the reversal is absolute, and the man who thought he could outrun his own shadow is about to find out how long the arm of the law really is. Never mistake shared blood for shared values, because while Brad was focused on the money, the auditor was focused on the justice. The morning light did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. This was the moment of legalized, systemic reversal, where the power did not shift through a struggle, but through the cold, unyielding gears of the institutional machines I had spent my life studying. I watched through the remote access service.x as the black sedans pulled into the driveway of my Greenwich estate, their presence a clinical answer to the moral outrage Brad had inflicted upon me. There was no violence, only the quiet, rhythmic tapping of federal agents on the mahogany door I had paid for with 40 years of honest auditing. Brad, you need to put down those bags of cash. The Bureau of Financial Crimes has had a GPS lock on those currency straps since the moment you pulled them from the basement safe. I said, my voice projecting through the estate's intercom with the firm, righteous authority of a man who had finally finished his final audit. He was standing on the porch, clutching $380,000 in stolen pension funds, his silk robe fluttering in the wind, a visual contrast to the steel handcuffs that were about to become his only jewelry. What is this, Sarah? Why are they here? Brad screamed, his voice a jagged, panicked sound that stripped away the last of his unearned arrogance. He looked at my daughter, waiting for the accomplice who would save him. But he found only a narrative distance that was as somber as a closed ledger. They are here because your 12% interest bridge loan has been accelerated into a total default, Brad. Sarah replied, her voice echoing the cold investigation style I had taught her since she was a child. The bank received a formal notification regarding the unpermitted structural modifications to the East Wing. Without property insurance, your $4.2 million collateral is worth zero in the eyes of the risk management department. The lead investigator, a man who understood that the truth always finds a way, stepped forward and spoke with the language of commands. Brad Miller, you are under arrest for 42 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement of $4 million in pension assets, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. The public consequence was the total humiliation of a man who thought he was a king. The private consequence was the systematic dismantling of a predator. You can't do this. I have the signed transfer deed. The house is mine. Brad yelled a desperate rhetorical question that no one bothered to answer. He tried to run toward the garage, but the agents moved with the efficiency of a system that had already won. He was brought to his knees on the very stone path where he had once told me I was a cost to be cut. The deed you hold is a fraudulent conveyance, Brad, I said, my voice calm as I watched the scene from my room at St. Mary's. Every digital transaction you made through those unhosted crypto wallets was mirrored in real time. I didn't just track the $4 million. I categorized them by tax code. You thought a forensic auditor was a relic of the past, but you forgot that a relic knows where the bodies and the bank accounts are buried. The role inversion was complete. The man who had thrown my veteran medals into a trash bag was now being treated like the very trash he tried to create. The neighbors began to gather at the end of the driveway. their phones recording the public shaming of the man who had bragged about his startup empire. This was the payoff I had promised a poetic justice that was as entertaining as it was absolute. "Sarah, tell them we're a team," Brad begged, looking up at his wife from the gravel. "We were never a team, Brad," Sarah said, stepping over the bags of cash he had dropped. "I've been a confidential informant for the Bureau of Financial Crimes for 72 hours. The CEO contract you signed wasn't a promotion. It was a signed confession of debt and a waiver of your spousal privilege. You wanted to treat my father like a line item. Well, the audit is finished and you're in the red." The tension that had been building since the garden party finally reached its payoff. I watched as they placed him in the back of the sedan, his startup dreams replaced by the reality of a federal indictment. He looked small, a pathetic figure who had mistaken shared blood for shared values. The system had worked exactly as I had designed it, shifting control quietly and irreversibly back into the hands of the one who truly understood its architecture. "We have the physical hard drive from the safe bill," the investigator said into the secure line, acknowledging the competence I had reactivated from a nursing home room. The GPS trackers in the cash bags confirmed his intent to flee. "We have the technical verisimilitude we need for a 99% conviction rate." As the cars drove away, leaving my estate in a silence that felt like a heavy, somber reflection, I realized that the grandpa story had reached its climax. Brad was gone and the legacy was restored, but the moral lesson remained etched in the quiet air of the morning. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of a reversal that would be whispered about in the boardrooms Brad used to envy. "Sarah, tell the staff to start the cleanup," I said, my voice dropping into a somber, reflective tone. "There is a lot of trash to move out of that house, and I want it gone before I arrive this afternoon." The systemic reversal was not just about the $4 million or the $1.2 million house. It was about the ownership of the truth. Brad had tried to rewrite my story, but he forgot that a forensic auditor always keeps a backup of the original. The hunter had finished the audit, and for the first time in years, the balance sheet was perfectly ruthlessly clean. The silence in this $1.2 million Greenwich estate is the most honest auditor I have ever encountered. I spent 42 years building this legacy stone by stone, only to find that the most expensive cost in a betrayal is not the capital you lose, but the sense of belonging that can never be audited back into existence. I stood in the center of the foyer, holding the brass key that Sarah had returned to me. It felt heavy cold and entirely different from how it had 3 days ago. It was no longer a symbol of ownership or a patriarch's pride. It had become a piece of administrative evidence, a cold reminder of the systemic reversal we had just finalized. Sarah, the regional bank, has officially released the freeze on the estate, and the Bureau of Financial Crimes confirmed the full recovery of the $4 million Brad embezzled from the pension fund, I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. I looked at my daughter, who stood by the window where she had once performed the most painful betrayal of my life. The IRS has finalized the seizure of his crypto assets, and the unhosted wallets we tracked through the remote access service .x have been drained to repay the shareholders. Technically, the audit is perfect. The balance sheet is clean. Sarah didn't look at the house. She looked at the black trash bag still sitting by the door, the one Brad had used to humiliate me. "The legal loop is closed, Dad," she replied, her voice sounding somber and reflective, stripped of the ice she had used during her performance. "Brad is facing a 20-year sentence for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The $380,000 we recovered from the GPS-tracked currency straps in his car was the final nail in his coffin. But as you said, the emotional aftertaste is something the law doesn't account for." I walked to the desk where my veteran medals had been tossed like garbage. "You told those people I was a cost to be cut, Sarah." You stood there and laughed while Brad fed me that thin soup at St. Mary's nursing home. I know it was a performance. I know it was the only way to make him feel untouchable enough to move the physical files to the safe. But in the world of forensic auditing, there is a concept called structural friction. When you rub two truths together to create a lie, you leave scars on the foundation. "It was the only way to save the family legacy, Bill," she said, using my name as if to acknowledge the professional distance we had created. If I had shown even a hint of loyalty, he would have invoked spousal privilege. And we never would have gotten the access codes for the remote access service.x. I had to make him believe I was his accomplice so I could be your secret ally. I understand the tactical necessity, Sarah. I really do. But a story like this doesn't end with a full resolution. It ends with an unconventional silence. We proved that the truth always finds a way, and we proved that age does not mean obsolescence. But we also proved that you can't audit a feeling of betrayal out of a relationship. The role inversion is complete. The master is back in his house, and the predator is in a cell. But the ownership of our trust is still in default. She stepped toward the door, her hand resting on the frame of the house I had built for her. "I'm moving out tomorrow morning, Dad," she said, a finality in her tone that no court order could match. "I've filed the bad faith divorce papers, and the settlement will ensure Brad never touches a cent of this estate again. But I can't stay here. Every time I look at that garden, I'll see the moment I told the world you were senile. Every time I look into this kitchen, I'll see the medication Brad tried to tamper with while I watched, waiting for the right moment to trigger the trap." "Poetic justice is a bittersweet thing, isn't it?" I asked, looking at the brass key again. "It tastes like the ash Brad said my victory would be. We won the $4 million, we saved the $1.2 million estate, and we ensured the villain received a 20-year sentence. But we are standing in a crime scene, not a home." I told her that I had spent my life teaching her that family is not just about blood, it is about shared values and loyalty. I told her that by choosing the truth over the performance, she had proven she was my true heir. But the cost of that education was the very family we were trying to protect. "Mao mu, không tao nên gia đình long trung thành mới tao nên điều đó." I whispered the old Vietnamese proverb, echoing the moral lesson of this final audit. "The loop is closed, Bill," Sarah said as she walked out into the afternoon light, leaving me alone in the foyer. "The auditor has finished his report." I sat down in my chair, the veteran medals in my lap and the brass key in my pocket. The house was quiet, the system was restored, and the $4 million were back where they belonged. The hunter had finished the chase. The reversal was absolute, and the justice was legalized. But as I looked at the empty rooms, I realized that the only thing I couldn't audit was the weight of the silence that followed a perfect revenge. The story of the dying patriarch was over, but the story of the man who remained was just beginning. The balance sheet was clean, the debt was paid, and the predator was gone. But in this $1.2 million empire, the only thing left was the aftertaste of a victory that felt an awful lot like a loss.